"Come inside, I've been waiting for you," the obese girl whispered to the lonely mountain man, right there in the middle of the dusty main street. Folks froze, church bell ringing in the distance, thinking they'd just heard a scandal. But inside the lamplit church, the truth hit like a hammer. She carried a letter from his past and a plea that could cost them both everything. Her family's only spring, their lifeline, was being stolen by a powerful company man, and the only proof she had to fight back carried a dangerous secret, a secret that, if revealed, could turn the whole town against her. From the high trails to the locked jail cell, they'll face false charges, fever, and a race against blasting powder. Trust will be tested, promises will be broken, and mercy might be the only weapon left. Will the lonely mountain man keep the promise he made long ago? Or will fear and greed bury the truth forever? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The warm afternoon sun beat down on the dusty streets of the small Colorado foothill town. Elias Crow, his weathered face creased with lines of experience, guided his mule to a halt outside the general store. He tied the reins securely, patting the animal's neck as he surveyed the bustling scene before him. The air was thick with the scent of pine and dry earth, mingling with the aroma of fresh-baked bread wafting from the nearby bakery. Elias's keen eyes, accustomed to scanning vast wilderness for signs of danger, now took in the familiar sights of town life. Wooden boardwalks creaked under the weight of hurrying townspeople, while the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer provided a steady rhythm to the day's activities. Suddenly, a burst of raucous laughter erupted from the saloon across the street. Elias turned his attention to the source of the commotion, his brow furrowing as he witnessed a group of young boys jeering at a passing woman and child. The woman was Rose Lark, a seamstress known throughout the town for her skillful needlework. She was a large-bodied young woman, her frame sturdy and strong from years of hard work. Despite her size, she moved with a grace that spoke of inner strength and dignity. At her side walked her little brother, Tommy, a frail boy of no more than 10 years. As the boy's taunts grew louder, Elias felt a surge of protective anger. He watched Rose closely, admiring the way she held her head high, ignoring the cruel words thrown her way. Her hand rested gently on Tommy's shoulder, guiding him forward with quiet determination. The pair made their way to the whitewashed church that stood as a beacon of hope at the end of the street. Rose paused at the doorway, her eyes scanning the area until they locked with Elias's weathered gaze. A flicker of recognition passed between them, and Rose's lips parted in a whisper that carried across the street. "Come inside," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the town's bustle. "I've been waiting for you." Elias felt a ripple of surprise at the unexpected invitation. He noticed several passers-by turn their heads, eyebrows raised at what seemed to be a scandalous proposition. Whispers and chuckles spread like wildfire among the onlookers, but Elias paid them no mind. There was something in Rose's eyes that spoke of urgency and importance. With deliberate steps, Elias crossed the street, the spurs on his boots jingling softly with each movement. He tipped his hat politely to those he passed, his face a mask of calm that revealed nothing of his curiosity or concern. As he reached the church steps, Rose held the heavy wooden door open for him. Elias nodded his thanks and stepped inside, the sudden coolness of the interior a welcome relief from the afternoon heat. The air inside was heavy with the scent of pine and beeswax, a comforting smell that reminded Elias of quieter times. Rose followed him in, closing the door behind them with a soft thud that echoed through the empty church. Tommy settled himself in a nearby pew, pulling out a small piece of wood and a whittling knife from his pocket. The boy began to work, his small hands moving with surprising skill as he shaped the wood. "Mr. Crow," Rose began, her voice low and respectful, "I thank you for coming. I know it might seem strange, me asking you here like this, but I have something important to show you." Elias watched as she reached into the folds of her skirt, producing a well-worn Bible. The leather cover was cracked and faded, speaking of years of use and cherished readings. Rose handled it with reverence, her fingers tracing the gold-embossed lettering before she carefully opened it. From between the delicate pages, she withdrew a folded letter. The paper was yellowed with age, its creases deep and well-defined from repeated folding and unfolding. Rose held it out to Elias, her eyes meeting his with a mix of hope and apprehension. "This letter," she explained, "was pressed into my late mother's Bible. It's addressed to you, Mr. Crow." Elias took the letter gently, his calloused fingers a stark contrast to the fragile paper. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. As he read, memories flooded back. A bitter winter storm, a young woman in distress, a promise made in the howling wind. "I remember," he said softly, his voice gruff with emotion. "Your mother. I found her out in that blizzard years ago, brought her to safety." Rose nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She often spoke of your kindness, Mr. Crow. She said you told her to call on you if trouble ever came." Elias folded the letter and handed it back to Rose. "I remember those words. Never thought she'd have cause to use 'em. What's the trouble, Miss Lark?" Rose took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring as if preparing for a battle. "It's our spring, Mr. Crow, the one that's been in our family for generations. Dolan Water and Mining has fenced it off, claiming it as their own." Elias's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the company. He'd heard whispers of their aggressive tactics, of how they were buying up water rights across the territory. "That ain't right," he said, his voice low and determined. "Your family's been here long before Dolan ever set foot in these parts." "We have the deeds," Rose explained, her voice trembling slightly. "But Mr. Dolan, he says they're not valid anymore. Says the law's changed." She paused, swallowing hard. "Mr. Crow, that spring, it's not just water for us, it's our livelihood, our home. Without it—" She trailed off, but Elias understood. In this harsh land, water was life itself. To lose it would mean losing everything. "I'd like to see for myself if you don't mind," Elias said, his tone gentle but firm. "Reckon I owe your mother that much at least." Relief washed over Rose's face. "Thank you, Mr. Crow. I can't tell you how much this means to us." As they prepared to leave, Tommy looked up from his whittling. In his hands was a small, intricately carved trout. He held it out to Elias, a shy smile on his face. "For luck," the boy said softly. Elias took the gift, marveling at the detail. "Much obliged, young man," he said, carefully tucking the carving into his vest pocket. "That's mighty fine work." Together, the unlikely trio made their way out of the church. As they stepped back into the sunlight, Elias was acutely aware of the curious stares from townsfolk. Whispers followed them down the street, speculation running wild about why the reclusive trapper was suddenly in the company of Rose Lark and her brother. But Elias paid them no mind. His thoughts were on the journey ahead, on the promise he'd made years ago, and on the injustice that threatened this small family. As they walked, he felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the call to right a wrong, to stand up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. The street was alive with activity, but to Elias it all faded into the background. His focus was on the task at hand, on honoring a long-ago promise and facing whatever challenges lay ahead. As they reached the edge of town, Elias cast one last look back at the curious faces watching their departure. Then, with a nod to Rose and Tommy, he turned his gaze to the path before them, ready to confront whatever trouble awaited at the disputed spring. The wagon creaked and swayed as it trundled along the narrow trail, its wooden wheels leaving shallow ruts in the dusty earth. Elias sat beside Rose on the driver's bench, his weathered hands holding the reins loosely as he guided the plodding mule forward. Tommy perched in the back, his small form nestled among sacks of grain and bundles of cloth. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, its warmth intensifying with each passing hour. Elias pulled his hat lower, shading his eyes from the glare. He glanced at Rose, noting the determination etched on her face as she stared ahead, her jaw set in a firm line. "How much further?" Elias asked, breaking the companionable silence that had settled over them. Rose turned to him, a small smile softening her features. "Not far now, Mr. Crow. Just beyond that next rise." Elias nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain. The land was changing, becoming more rugged as they approached the foothills. Scrub brush gave way to stunted pines, their branches reaching skyward like gnarled fingers. As they crested the rise, a narrow box canyon came into view. Elias felt Rose stiffen beside him, her breath catching in her throat. He followed her gaze and saw what had caused her distress. Fresh fence posts stood in neat rows cutting across the mouth of the canyon. Newly painted boards hung from the wire, their stark white lettering a jarring contrast to the natural landscape. "Dolan Water and Mining," they proclaimed, an unwelcome intrusion on the Lark family's land. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop, the mule snorting softly as it came to rest. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "This ain't right," Elias muttered, his voice low and gravelly. He turned to Rose, seeing the mix of anger and despair in her eyes. "Show me the spring." Rose nodded, climbing down from the wagon with practiced ease. She helped Tommy down, her hand lingering protectively on his shoulder. Elias followed, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust as he hit the ground. They walked in silence, passing through a gap in the fence line. Elias's keen eyes noted the freshly turned earth around the posts, evidence of recent work. The further they went into the canyon, the more lush the vegetation became. The air grew cooler, carrying the sweet scent of water. Finally, they rounded a bend and Elias saw the spring. It bubbled up from the ground, clear and pure, forming a small pool before trickling away in a narrow stream. The sight of it, so vital and alive in the midst of the arid landscape, made Elias's throat tighten with emotion. Rose stood beside the spring, her hand resting on a smooth boulder nearby. "This is it, Mr. Crow," she said softly. "This spring has been the lifeblood of our family for generations. It waters our garden, keeps our stock alive." She paused, swallowing hard. "Without it, we have nothing." Elias nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He'd seen what happened to homesteads when their water was cut off. It was a slow, agonizing death for both land and people. "You mentioned a deed," Elias said, his voice gentle but firm. "May I see it?" Rose reached into her skirt pocket, pulling out a folded document. She handed it to Elias with reverence, as if passing along something sacred. In many ways, Elias realized, it was. He unfolded the paper carefully, mindful of its age and importance. His eyes scanned the formal language, taking in the details. At the bottom, he saw 2 signatures that made his eyebrows rise in surprise. "This bears the seal of a territorial judge," he murmured, "and it's co-signed by Chief 2 Trails." He looked up at Rose, a new respect in his gaze. "This grants your family water use in perpetuity. It's as solid a claim as I've ever seen." Relief washed over Rose's face, quickly followed by determination. "That's what I've been trying to tell Mr. Dolan and his men. But they won't listen. They say the law's changed, that old treaties don't matter anymore." Before Elias could respond, a harsh cough broke the silence. Tommy, who had been quietly exploring the area, was doubled over, his small frame shaking with each racking cough. Rose was at his side in an instant, her arm around his shoulders. Elias frowned, noting the boy's labored breathing once the coughing subsided. "How long's he been like this?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Rose's face fell. "It comes and goes," she said softly. "The dust makes it worse. That's why this spring is so important. The moist air here, it helps him breathe easier." Elias nodded, his resolve strengthening. He walked to the edge of the spring, cupping his hands in the cool, clear water. Turning to Tommy, he offered the water with a gentle smile. "Here, son. This'll help wash the dust from your throat." Tommy approached shyly, his eyes wide. He drank from Elias's hands, the water spilling over his chin. As he finished, a bright smile spread across his face, chasing away the pallor that had settled there. "Thank you, Mr. Crow," Tommy said, his voice stronger now. Elias ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. "You're welcome, Tommy. And please, call me Elias." As they prepared to leave, Elias took one last look around the canyon, His eyes narrowed as he caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above. A lone rider sat atop a horse watching them. Even at this distance, Elias could see the man's hand resting casually on the butt of a pistol. "One of Dolan's men?" Rose asked, following Elias's gaze. Elias nodded, his jaw tightening. "Likely so. Keeping an eye on their new property, I reckon." They made their way back to the wagon in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As Elias helped Rose and Tommy up onto the bench, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their troubles. The mule snorted impatiently as Elias took up the reins. With a gentle flick, they started their journey back to town. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm, punctuated by the occasional cough from Tommy. Elias's mind was racing, considering the deed, the fence, and the watchful eyes of Dolan's men. He knew that the fight for the Lark family's water rights was far from over. But as he glanced at Rose's determined profile and Tommy's trusting face, he felt a fierce protectiveness well up inside him. He had made a promise years ago, and Elias Crow was a man of his word. Whatever came next, he would stand by this family and see justice done. The road ahead might be difficult, but with the strength of right on their side, Elias believed they stood a fighting chance. As the wagon rolled on, leaving the box canyon and its precious spring behind, Elias's resolve hardened. The battle for water, for life itself in this unforgiving land, had begun, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead for the sake of a promise made and a family in need. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as evening settled over the small Colorado town. The day's heat lingered, but a cool breeze brought welcome relief to the dusty streets. As twilight deepened, an unusual commotion drew townsfolk from their homes and businesses. Patrick Dolan, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed out of place in the frontier town, strode purposefully towards the whitewashed church. His polished boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk, a sharp contrast to the soft shuffling of curious onlookers gathering behind him. In his hand, he clutched a rolled-up notice, his knuckles white with determination. As he reached the church door, Dolan turned to face the growing crowd. His voice, smooth as oil, carried easily in the evening air. "Good people of our fine town," he began, a practiced smile gracing his features. "I come bearing important news that affects us all." With a flourish, he unrolled the notice and tacked it to the church door. The paper crinkled loudly in the sudden hush that fell over the assembled townspeople. Dolan stepped back, allowing everyone to see the bold lettering at the top. "Public Notice Water Rights Acquisition." "By the authority vested in me," Dolan continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "I hereby declare that the spring located in the Box Canyon north of town is now the rightful property of the Colorado and Western Railroad Company. This vital resource will be used to establish a tank farm, ensuring the progress and prosperity of our region." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in approval while others exchanged worried glances. Dolan's eyes scanned the faces before him, searching for one in particular. When he spotted Rose Lark at the edge of the gathering, his smile turned cold. "I feel it is my duty to inform you all," Dolan said, his voice dripping with false concern, "that there are those among us who would seek to defraud this company and, by extension, this town." He pointed an accusing finger at Rose. "This woman claims to have rights to the spring, but I assure you, her so-called deed is nothing but a worthless piece of paper." Rose stood frozen, her face flushing with a mix of anger and humiliation as all eyes turned to her. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The weight of the town's judgment seemed to press down on her, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, a figure pushed through the crowd. Elias Crow stepped forward, his weathered face set in grim determination. He planted himself between Rose and Dolan, his presence alone commanding attention. "Now hold on just a minute," Elias growled, his voice low but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "I've seen that deed with my own eyes. It bears the seal of a territorial judge and the signature of Chief Two Trails. That's as solid a claim as they come." Dolan's smirk never faltered. He leaned in close to Elias, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Paper won't keep the rails from drinking, old man. Best you and your friends." Understand that before things get unpleasant." As the two men faced off, Reverend Josiah Bell stood nearby, his hands twisting nervously in front of him. The preacher's face was pale, his eyes darting between Dolan, Elias, and Rose. It was clear he wanted to speak up, to say something in defense of the truth he knew. But fear kept his lips sealed, and he remained silent, the weight of his inaction visible in the slump of his shoulders. The tension in the air was palpable, threatening to spark into something more dangerous. But before it could, a new voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Rose, dear," called Mrs. Finch, the storekeeper. The older woman pushed her way forward, her kind face creased with concern. She pressed a small brass key into Rose's hand, closing the young woman's fingers around it. "Take the room above my store for the night. You'll be safe there." Rose nodded gratefully, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Without a word, she turned and hurried away, Elias close behind her. The crowd parted to let them pass, a mix of sympathy and suspicion following in their wake. As they entered Mrs. Finch's mercantile, the rich scents of leather, coffee, and dried goods enveloped them. Rose led the way up a narrow staircase at the back of the store, the old wood creaking under their feet. The key turned smoothly in the lock, revealing a small but tidy room tucked under the eaves. Rose moved to the pot-bellied stove in the corner, her hands working automatically to start a fire. Elias watched her for a moment, noting the tremble in her fingers and the set of her jaw. Without a word, he pulled out a chair and sat at the small table, retrieving Tommy's whittling knife from his pocket. As Rose began to prepare a simple stew, the rhythmic sound of Elias sharpening the knife filled the room. The familiar tasks seemed to calm them both, bringing a sense of normalcy to an evening that had been anything but normal. When Tommy joined them, his small face pinched with worry, Elias beckoned him over. "Come here, son," he said gently. "Let's see about fixing up this knife of yours." Tommy's eyes widened as Elias showed him how to hold the blade, guiding his small hands as they worked together to repair the wooden handle. For a while, the only sounds were the scrape of the knife, the bubbling of the stew, and the distant murmur of voices from the street below. As Rose set bowls of steaming stew on the table, Elias bowed his head. In a voice rough with emotion, he offered a simple prayer. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the shelter you've provided. Watch over us and guide us through these troubled times. Amen." Tommy's eyes brightened at the kind words, a small smile tugging at his lips. As they began to eat, Rose felt a fragile warmth settle over the room. Despite the tension and uncertainty that awaited them outside in this moment, they were safe and together. The clink of spoons against bowls mingled with the muffled sounds drifting up from the street. Boots scuffed against wooden sidewalks, and occasional bursts of laughter floated on the evening air. It was a stark reminder that the entire town was watching, waiting to see how this conflict would unfold. As they finished their meal, Elias leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting Rose's across the table. "I made a promise to your mother," he said softly, "and I aim to keep it. We'll figure this out, Rose. I'll help you fight for what's rightfully yours." Rose nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Crow," she whispered. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Elias reached out, his calloused hand covering hers for a brief moment. "We're in this together now," he said. "And together, we'll find a way through." As night settled fully over the town, the small room above Mrs. Finch's store became a sanctuary. Outside, the wheels of greed and progress continued to turn. But within these walls, a small family of choice had formed, bound by promises, kindness, and the determination to stand up for what was right. The lamplight flickered, casting long shadows across the small room above Mrs. Finch's store. Rose sat at the edge of her bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Elias leaned against the wall, his weathered face patient and kind. Tommy had finally drifted off to sleep, his soft snores a gentle counterpoint to the tension in the air. Rose took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Mr. Crow," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about my mother and about me." Elias nodded, encouraging her to continue. My mother, Rose said, her eyes fixed on her hands. She was Comanche. She glanced up, gauging Elias's reaction. His expression remained unchanged, save for a slight softening around his eyes. I reckon that explains a few things, Elias said gently, like why Chief Two Trails co-signed that deed of yours. Rose nodded, relief washing over her. Yes, that's right. The chief. He knew my mother from when she was a girl. He wanted to make sure we'd always have a place here. A home between two worlds. Elias stroked his chin thoughtfully. That signature, it's what gives your claim real strength. But I'm guessing you haven't told many folks about your heritage. No, Rose admitted, her voice tight. People already look at me sideways for being different. If they knew I was part Comanche, well, I'm afraid it would ruin any chance we have of keeping the spring. Elias sighed heavily, understanding the weight of Rose's confession. It's a hard choice you're facing, Rose. Hiding your heritage might make things easier with some folks in town, but it could also give Dolan a way to challenge the deed's validity. Rose nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I know, but what can we do? Elias was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through their options. Finally, he spoke. There's a reservation agency about 2 days' ride from here. If we can get them to reaffirm the deed, with Chief Two Trails there to vouch for it, we might have a chance. Rose's eyes widened. 2 days, but Tommy, his lungs? I know it'll be hard on him, Elias said softly, but it might be our best shot at keeping the spring. We can take it slow, make sure he rests plenty. Rose looked over at her sleeping brother, her heart heavy with worry, but she knew Elias was right. They had to try. All right, she said, squaring her shoulders. When do we leave? First light, Elias replied. We'll need to move quick and quiet. I don't trust Dolan not to try something if he gets wind of our plan. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Elias was already in the livery, readying a sturdy pack mule. He carefully secured their supplies, making sure everything was balanced and secure. Rose appeared in the doorway, Tommy at her side. The boy's eyes were wide with excitement, despite the early hour. Are we really going on an adventure, Mr. Crow? He asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Elias knelt down to Tommy's level, his face serious but kind. That we are, son. But it's going to be a hard ride, especially for you. We'll be climbing up into the hills where the air's thinner. You'll need to tell us right away if you start feeling poorly, you hear? Tommy nodded solemnly. Yes, sir, I promise. As they finished their preparations, Mrs. Finch appeared, her arms laden with packages. I've brought some dry goods for your journey, she said, her voice low. And a word of warning. I overheard some talk last night. Dolan's got friends in the sheriff's office. You'd best watch your backs. Elias nodded grimly. Much obliged, Mrs. Finch, for everything. The sun was just peeking over the horizon as they led their animals out onto the main street. The town was still mostly asleep, but a few early risers watched them with wary eyes. Rose kept her head high, refusing to be cowed by their stares. As they reached the edge of town, Elias swung up into his saddle, scanning the ridgelines with practiced eyes. He'd spent years in these hills, first as an army scout, then as a trapper. He knew every fold in the land, every hidden draw where an ambush might be waiting. Stay close, he said to Rose and Tommy, and keep your eyes open. Trouble has a way of finding folks on the trail. They set out at a steady pace, the pack mule plodding along behind them. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew noticeably thinner. Tommy's breathing became more labored, and Rose watched him with worried eyes. Elias called for frequent stops, making sure Tommy had plenty of time to rest and catch his breath. During one such break, as they sat in the shade of a gnarled old juniper, Elias pulled out a small wooden flute. This here's a gift from an old Ute friend, he explained, his fingers running over the smooth surface. He taught me a song that's supposed to help ease troubled breathing. As Elias began to play, a haunting melody drifted on the mountain air. Tommy's eyes widened in wonder, and even Rose felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. When the song ended, Tommy took a deep breath, and Rose was relieved to hear it come easier than before. Thank you, Mr. Crow, the boy said softly. Elias smiled, tucking the flute away. Music's got a power all its own, Tommy. Sometimes it can heal in ways nothing else can. As they continued their journey, Rose found herself watching Elias with new eyes. This gruff, kind man who had come to their aid was full of surprises. She wondered what other secrets he might be holding, what other skills he might have picked up in his years of wandering these wild lands. The sun was high overhead when they crested a rise, revealing a sweeping vista of the valley below. In the distance, Rose could just make out the glint of water, their spring, the heart of all this trouble. "We'll make camp soon," Elias said, gesturing to a sheltered hollow nearby. "Best to rest up while we can. Tomorrow's ride will be even harder." As they settled in for the night, the weight of their journey pressed heavily on Rose's mind. She knew that revealing her heritage at the agency could bring a world of trouble down on her and Tommy. But as she watched Elias tending the fire, his face lined with determination, she felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to see them through. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, as Elias, Rose, and Tommy set out on their journey. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Elias led the way, his keen eyes scanning the trail ahead for any signs of danger or difficulty. Tommy, perched atop the pack mule, gazed around in wide-eyed wonder. "Look, Rose," he exclaimed, pointing to a pair of hawks circling overhead. "They're so big." Rose smiled at her brother's enthusiasm, but her eyes held a hint of worry. She knew the journey would be hard on him, and they had barely begun. As the sun climbed higher, the trail grew steeper. Tommy's excitement gave way to fatigue, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing hour. Elias called for frequent stops, allowing the boy to rest and catch his breath. "How you holding up, Tommy?" Elias asked during one such break, handing the boy his canteen. Tommy took a long drink before answering. "I'm all right, Mr. Crow, just a little tired." Rose knelt beside her brother, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We can rest longer if you need to, Tommy." "There's no rush." Elias nodded in agreement. "Your sister's right, we've got plenty of daylight left." As the day wore on, their progress slowed to a crawl. Tommy's coughing fits became more frequent, and Rose's worry grew with each one. Elias kept a watchful eye on both of them, his weathered face set in lines of concern. By mid-afternoon, it was clear they wouldn't make it as far as Elias had hoped. "There's a good camping spot up ahead," he said, pointing to a grassy hollow nestled between two rocky outcroppings. "We'll stop there for the night." Rose nodded gratefully, relief evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Elias. I think that would be best for Tommy." They made camp in the sheltered hollow, the ground soft with thick grass. Elias quickly gathered wood and built a small fire, its warmth a welcome comfort as the evening air grew cooler. As Rose helped Tommy settle near the fire, Elias rummaged through his saddlebags. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, unwrapping it to reveal strips of dried venison. "It ain't much," he said, offering the meat to Rose and Tommy, "but it'll keep our strength up." Tommy's eyes lit up at the sight of the food. "Thank you, Mr. Crow," he said, eagerly taking a piece. Rose accepted her portion with a grateful smile. "You're very kind, Elias. We appreciate everything you're doing for us." As they ate, Rose pulled out a worn shirt from her pack and began to mend a tear in the sleeve. Her fingers moved deftly, the needle flashing in the firelight. Elias watched her work, impressed by her skill. "You've got a real talent there, Rose," he said softly. Rose ducked her head, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's just something I picked up out of necessity," she replied. "But thank you." As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Tommy huddled closer to the fire, shivering despite the warmth. Elias noticed, and without a word, shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over the boy's shoulders. "Oh no, Mr. Crow," Tommy protested weakly. "I can't take your coat." Elias smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Course you can. I've got plenty of meat on my bones to keep me warm. You need it more than I do." Rose watched this exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude. She caught Elias's eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." He nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes softening as they met hers. As the night deepened, Tommy drifted off to sleep, wrapped snugly in Elias's coat. Rose and Elias sat in companionable silence, gazing up at the star-studded sky. After a while, Rose spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elias, can I tell you something?" He turned to her, his expression open and attentive. "Of course, Rose. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then said, "Back in town, the folks there, they have a name for me. They call me Big Lark." Her voice held a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then he replied, his voice gentle but firm, "Well, I reckon big wings catch more light." Rose looked at him in surprise, then ducked her head to hide the smile that spread across her face. In that moment, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The night passed peacefully, but just before dawn, Elias's eyes snapped open. He sat up slowly, listening intently. There, just at the edge of hearing, the sound of a horse moving along the ridge above their camp. Rose stirred, sensing his tension. "What is it?" she whispered. "Rider on the ridge," Elias murmured back. "Don't move. They might not have spotted us yet." They waited, barely breathing, as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, then began to fade. The rider, whoever they were, didn't approach the camp. When the sound had completely disappeared, Elias relaxed slightly. "Could be just a traveler," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "But we'd best be careful from here on out." As the sun rose, they broke camp quickly and quietly. Elias studied the trail ahead, his brow furrowed in thought. "We'll take a side path," he announced. "It's longer, but it'll keep us out of that open valley ahead. Better safe than sorry." Rose nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution. She helped Tommy onto the mule, making sure he was secure and comfortable before they set out. The side trail Elias chose was rough and winding, but it kept them hidden from any prying eyes that might be watching the main path. Tommy bore the difficult journey bravely, though his coughing fits became more frequent as the morning wore on. By noon, they reached a narrow river crossing. The water rushed by, swift and cold, but shallow enough to ford safely. Elias led the way, testing each step carefully before guiding Rose and Tommy across. On the far bank, they found a small, sheltered clearing that would serve well as a campsite. "We'll stop here for the night," Elias said. "Give Tommy a chance to rest up proper." As they set up camp, Rose noticed Elias constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from the rifle at his side. His vigilance both reassured and unsettled her. "Do you think we're being followed?" she asked quietly as they gathered firewood. Elias met her gaze steadily. "Can't say for certain," he replied, "but it pays to be cautious. Don't you worry, though. I aim to see you and Tommy safe to that agency no matter what." Rose felt a rush of warmth at his words, and not for the first time, she found herself grateful for this quiet, steadfast man who had come into their lives. As they worked together to prepare the camp, she realized that in the short time they'd known each other, Elias had become more than just a guide or a protector. He was becoming a friend, and perhaps something more. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. As Rose helped Tommy settle in for the night, she caught Elias's eye across the campfire. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, and she felt a flutter in her chest. Whatever challenges lay ahead on their journey, Rose knew that with Elias by their side, they stood a fighting chance. As she drifted off to sleep that night, her last thought was of his kind eyes and gentle words. "Big wings catch more light," she murmured to herself, a smile playing on her lips as sleep claimed her. By late afternoon on the second day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty path as Rose, Tommy, and Elias approached the reservation agency. The wooden building stood weathered and plain against the backdrop of distant mesas, its windows reflecting the orange glow of sunset. Rose's heart quickened as they dismounted. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands, acutely aware of the precious deed tucked safely in her pocket. Elias gave her a reassuring nod as he helped Tommy down from the mule. "We've come this far," he said softly. "No turning back now." They entered the agency, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Behind a scratched wooden desk sat a clerk, his shirt rumpled and his expression one of bored indifference. He barely glanced up as they approached. "Can I help you?" he drawled, not bothering to hide his lack of interest. Rose stepped forward, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Yes, sir. We're here about a water rights deed that needs reaffirmation." The clerk sighed heavily as if their presence was a great inconvenience. "We're about to close for the day. Come back another time." Rose felt a surge of frustration rise within her. They had traveled so far, endured so much. To be dismissed so casually was almost more than she could bear. She opened her mouth to protest, but Elias laid a gentle hand on her arm. "If you don't mind," he said to the clerk, his tone polite but firm, "we'll wait." The clerk shrugged, clearly not caring one way or the other. Rose shot Elias a grateful look, amazed at his calm persistence in the face of such indifference. As they settled onto a hard wooden bench to wait, the door swung open. A dignified older man entered, his silver hair braided and his bearing regal despite his advancing years. Rose recognized him immediately. Chief Two Trails. The chief's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene before him. His gaze lingered on Rose, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. "What brings you here, child?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. Rose stood, her hands clasped tightly around the deed. "Chief Two Trails. I'm Rose Lark. My mother. You knew her. We've come about the spring deed you co-signed years ago." Understanding dawned in the chief's eyes. He gestured for Rose to approach, and she did so, carefully unfolding the precious document. Chief Two Trails read the deed slowly, his weathered fingers tracing the lines of text. Then, to Rose's surprise, he placed his hand gently over hers. "I remember," he said softly. "I promised your mother water to life, not locomotives." His eyes met Rose's, filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "This promise still stands." Relief washed over Rose like a cool stream. "Then you'll help us?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. The chief nodded solemnly. "I will reaffirm this deed with a seal and sworn statement. It is the right thing to do." As Chief Two Trails spoke with the clerk, arranging for the necessary paperwork, Rose felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in us, for bringing us here." Elias ducked his head, a faint blush coloring his weathered cheeks. "Weren't nothing," he mumbled, "just doing what's right." Their moment was interrupted by a fit of coughing from Tommy. The boy's face was flushed, his breathing labored. Rose knelt beside him, worry etching lines across her forehead. An elderly woman who had been observing quietly from the corner now approached. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes sparkled with warmth and wisdom. "That's a nasty cough, little one," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Auntie Najoni. May I help?" Rose nodded gratefully, and Auntie Najoni knelt beside Tommy. From a pouch at her waist, she produced a small sprig of green leaves. "This is bear root," she explained, holding it out for Tommy to see. "It will ease your breathing and soothe your throat." She showed Rose how to crush the leaves and steep them in hot water to make a tea. "Give him this twice a day," she instructed. "It will help him breathe easier." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, the small group gathered in the agency yard. The air was filled with the rich, smoky scent of mesquite wood burning in a nearby fire pit. Chief Two Trails had arranged for a simple but hearty meal to be shared. Bowls of steaming stew were passed around, along with thick slices of cornbread. Rose watched in wonder as people from different worlds, Elias, the chief, Auntie Najoni, and even the reluctant clerk, sat together, sharing food and conversation. Tommy sipped cautiously at his bear root tea, his face relaxing as the warm liquid soothed his throat. Rose felt a surge of hope as she watched her brother's breathing ease. As they ate, Chief Two Trails spoke of the land, of the importance of keeping promises, and of the strength found in unity. His words seemed to weave a spell over the gathering, reminding them all of the deeper truths that connected them. Elias sat quietly, listening intently to every word. Rose noticed how his eyes never strayed far from her and Tommy, as if he was still watching over them even in this moment of peace. As the meal drew to a close, Chief Two Trails produced the reaffirmed deed, now bearing a fresh seal and his sworn statement. He handed it to Rose with a solemnity that brought tears to her eyes. "Guard this well," he said. "It is more than just a piece of paper. It is a promise to the land and to your ancestors." Rose clutched the document to her chest, feeling the weight of its importance. "I will," she vowed. "Thank you, Chief Two Trails, for everything." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Rose felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had come so far, faced so much uncertainty, but in this moment, surrounded by newfound allies and with the strength of the reaffirmed deed, she allowed herself to hope. She caught Elias's eye across the fire, and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. In that moment, Rose knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey back to town began as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. Rose, Elias, and Tommy set out with renewed determination, the precious reaffirmed deed safely tucked away. As they rode, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and a chill wind whipped across the open plains. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and Elias cast a wary eye skyward. "Looks like we're in for some weather," he remarked, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Best we find a good spot to hunker down for the night." Rose nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tommy, nestled securely in front of her on the horse, shivered slightly. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice small against the rising wind. "Not too far, little fella," Elias assured him. "I know a place that'll keep us dry." As the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropped steadily. The first fat raindrops began to fall, just as Elias led them off the main trail and into a narrow canyon. There, nestled against the red rock walls, was a broad overhang, a natural shelter from the storm. "Here we are," Elias announced, helping Rose and Tommy dismount. "Home sweet home, at least for tonight." They worked quickly to set up camp, Elias tending to the horses while Rose gathered what dry kindling she could find. Tommy, eager to help, collected small stones to ring their fire pit. As the rain began to fall in earnest, pattering against the stone above them, they huddled close to the small, crackling fire. The sound of the rain, steady and soothing, filled the air. Tommy's eyes grew heavy, and he leaned against Rose's side. "Tell us a story, Mr. Crow," he murmured sleepily. Elias looked startled for a moment, then his weathered face softened. "Well, I suppose I could tell you about trapping in deep winter," he began, his voice low and warm. "It ain't easy work, but there's a beauty to it that's hard to describe." As Elias spoke, painting vivid pictures of snow-covered mountains in the silence of the wilderness, Rose found herself drawn in. She listened quietly, watching the firelight dance across Elias's face, noting how his eyes seemed to light up as he shared his experiences. "The cold can be fierce," Elias continued, "but there's something about facing it, about surviving out there, that makes a person feel alive." He paused, looking almost embarrassed by his own words. "Course, it's lonely work too. Nights like this, with good company, they're worth more than any fur I ever trapped." Rose felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She caught Elias's eye and smiled softly, a silent thank you for his words and his presence. The next morning dawned cold and damp, but the rain had passed. They broke camp quickly, eager to cover the remaining distance to town. As they rode, the sun slowly burned away the mist, and by late afternoon, they crested the final hill overlooking the familiar streets of home. Rose felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as they approached. So much had changed in just a few days, and she wondered how the town would receive them and the news they brought. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the church windows, Reverend Bell stood before the congregation. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the agency affirmation, but his voice was clear and strong as he began to read. "Let it be known," he intoned, "that the water rights deed held by the Lark family has been reaffirmed by the territorial agency and chief two trails of the Comanche Nation. This grant of water use in perpetuity is hereby recognized as valid and binding." A ripple of murmurs swept through the church. Rose, seated near the back with Elias and Tommy, felt her heart racing. She scanned the faces of the townsfolk, trying to gauge their reactions. Some, like Mrs. Finch, nodded approvingly. Others wore expressions of surprise or suspicion. Near the front, she caught sight of one of Dolan's men, his face twisted in a scowl. As Reverend Bell finished reading, a hush fell over the congregation. Then, slowly, people began to turn in their seats, craning their necks to look at Rose and her companions. She felt Elias shift beside her, as if readying himself to stand between her and any potential threat. But then Mrs. Finch stood up, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Well, I say it's about time justice was done," she declared. "That spring's been lark water since before half of us were born." Her words seemed to break the tension. More voices joined in, some agreeing, others raising questions. But the tide of opinion seemed to be turning in Rose's favor. As the congregation began to disperse, Rose felt a lightness in her heart she hadn't experienced in years. She turned to Elias, who was watching the departing townsfolk with a look of cautious optimism. "Mr. Crow," she said softly, drawing his attention, "I can't thank you enough for all you've done." Elias ducked his head, a faint blush coloring his weathered cheeks. Then, in a rare moment of ease, he met her eyes and asked, "Miss Rose, if you don't mind, I was thinking I might build a gate at the spring. Something sturdy with your family name on it. Would that be all right?" Rose felt a surge of emotion at his words. She laughed softly, her eyes bright with relief and something more. "That would be more than all right, Mr. Crow. That would be wonderful." As they stepped out of the church into the cool night air, the town seemed calmer somehow. The streets were quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence of recent days. Tommy yawned widely, the excitement of the day finally catching up with him. Rose scooped him up, marveling at how much lighter her own steps felt. "Come on," Elias said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you both home." As they walked through the starlit streets, Rose felt a sense of hope she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but for now, in this moment, victory tasted sweet. The next morning dawned with a deceptive brightness, the sun peeking through clouds that had lingered from the previous night's rain. Rose and Tommy set out early, their steps light as they made their way to Mrs. Finch's mercantile. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, drawing them in like a warm embrace. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch," Tommy called out cheerfully as they entered the store. The bell above the door tinkled merrily, announcing their arrival. Mrs. Finch looked up from behind the counter, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I've got a loaf just out of the oven for you two." As Rose reached for her coin purse, Mrs. Finch waved her hand dismissively. Now, dear, this one's on the house. Consider it a celebration of your victory." Rose felt a lump form in her throat, touched by the kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. We're mighty grateful." While Rose and Tommy chatted with Mrs. Finch across town, a very different scene was unfolding. Sheriff Hanson approached Elias Crow, who was tending to his mule outside the livery stable. The sheriff's face was grim, his steps heavy with reluctance. "Elias," he called out, his voice carrying a note of apology, "I'm afraid I've got some bad news." Elias straightened up, his weathered face creasing with concern. "What's the trouble, Sheriff?" Sheriff Hanson pulled out a folded paper from his vest pocket, holding it out for Elias to see. "I've got a warrant here for your arrest. Assault on a company man. I'm sorry, Elias, but I've got to take you in." Elias's eyes widened in disbelief. Assault? That's nonsense, and you know it, Sheriff. I haven't laid a hand on anyone. The sheriff shook his head, his voice low. I know, Elias, but the warrant's signed and sealed. My hands are tied. With a heavy heart, Sheriff Hansen led Elias to the jailhouse. The clang of the cell door echoed through the small building, a sound that seemed to mock the justice Elias had fought so hard to uphold. Back at the Mercantile, Rose and Tommy were just preparing to leave when Patrick Dolan sauntered in. His smile was all teeth and no warmth as he approached them. Well, well, he drawled, if it isn't the Lark family. I hope you're enjoying your little victory while it lasts. Rose instinctively pulled Tommy closer to her side. Mr. Dolan, she said, her voice cool but steady. We have nothing to discuss. Dolan's eyes narrowed. Oh, I think we do. You see, your friend Mr. Crow has found himself in a bit of trouble. Seems he's been arrested for assault. Rose felt her heart drop. That's impossible. Elias would never. The law says otherwise, Dolan interrupted smoothly. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But I'm a reasonable man, Miss Lark. I'm willing to make a deal. Rose stood her ground, though her insides churned with fear. What kind of deal? Dolan's smile widened. It's simple, really. Sign over the spring to me and I'll make sure all charges against Mr. Crow are dropped. Refuse and, well, let's just say jail can be awfully hard on a man his age. Tommy tugged at Rose's sleeve, his eyes wide with confusion and worry. Rose felt torn between rage and despair. Dolan wasn't finished. He glanced down at Tommy, his gaze lingering on the boy's pale face. And let's not forget about your brother here. That cough of his sounds nasty. Be a shame if he couldn't get the medicine he needs. Rose's voice shook with barely contained anger. You're threatening a child? Have you no shame? Dolan shrugged, unperturbed. I'm just stating facts, Miss Lark. Medicine costs money. Money you won't have if you keep fighting this losing battle. He tipped his hat mockingly. Think it over. I'll be waiting for your decision. With that, he turned and left the store, the bell chiming cheerfully in stark contrast to the heavy silence he left behind. Rose stood frozen, the warm loaf of bread in her arm suddenly feeling like a lead weight. Mrs. Finch approached cautiously, her face etched with concern. Rose, dear? Are you all right? Before Rose could answer, Tommy let out a harsh, racking cough. She looked down at him in alarm, noticing for the first time how flushed his cheeks had become. Tommy? She said, pressing a hand to his forehead. Her heart sank as she felt the heat radiating from his skin. Oh no. Mrs. Finch, do you have any willow bark tea? Mrs. Finch nodded quickly. Of course, dear. I'll bring some up to your room right away. The rest of the day passed in a blur of worry and indecision. Rose sat by Tommy's bedside in their small room above the Mercantile, watching helplessly as his fever rose and his cough worsened. The willow bark tea seemed to offer little relief. As evening fell, rain began to patter against the roof, quickly building to a steady downpour. The sound seemed to mock Rose's tumultuous thoughts, each drop another weight on her already burdened shoulders. In the dim lamplight, Rose studied Tommy's face. His cheeks were flushed with fever, his breathing labored. She thought of Elias, alone in a jail cell, unjustly accused. She thought of the spring, the legacy her mother had fought so hard to preserve, justice or survival. The choice loomed before her like an insurmountable mountain. The rain hammered harder, as if urging her to decide. Rose closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. How could she choose between the land that was her birthright and the people she had come to care for so deeply? The spring was more than just water. It was her heritage, her mother's final gift. But what good was that heritage if Tommy suffered? What was the point of holding onto the land if Elias paid the price? The night grew darker, the rain showing no signs of letting up. Rose sat vigil by Tommy's bedside, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision before her. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the battle raging in the small room above the Mercantile, a battle not of fists or guns but of conscience and survival. As Tommy's cough rattled through the room once more, Rose felt her resolve wavering. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. But now, with so much at stake, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Rose watched them, feeling as though they were a reflection of her own turbulent thoughts. In the morning, she would have to make a choice. But for now, all she could do was listen to the rain, tend to her brother, and pray for a wisdom she feared might never come. As evening settled over the small town, the rain continued its relentless assault on the roof of Mrs. Finch's mercantile. Inside the cramped room above the shop, Rose Lark sat vigil by her brother Tommy's bedside, her worry growing with each passing hour. The boy's fever, which had been concerning earlier in the day, now burned with an intensity that sent chills down Rose's spine. Tommy tossed fitfully on the narrow bed, his skin flushed and damp with sweat. His breathing came in short, labored gasps, punctuated by harsh coughs that seemed to rattle his entire small frame. Rose pressed a hand to his forehead, her heart sinking at the heat radiating from his skin. "Oh, Tommy," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Please, hold on." A soft knock at the door startled Rose from her worried thoughts. Mrs. Finch entered, her kind face etched with concern. In her hands, she carried a basin of cool water and a clean cloth. "How is he, dear?" Mrs. Finch asked softly, setting the basin on the bedside table. Rose shook her head, unable to find words through the lump in her throat. Mrs. Finch understood without explanation. She dipped the cloth in the cool water, wrung it out, and gently placed it on Tommy's burning forehead. "There now," Mrs. Finch murmured, her touch motherly and sure. "This should help bring down the fever a bit." Rose watched as Tommy's furrowed brow relaxed slightly at the cool touch. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," she managed to say. "I don't know what we'd do without your kindness." Mrs. Finch turned to Rose, her eyes soft with compassion. She took Rose's hand in her own, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Now, you listen here, Rose Lark. I want you to know something, and I want you to hear it clear as day." Rose looked up, meeting the older woman's steady gaze. "No matter what happens, no matter what choice you make, I'll stand by you," Mrs. Finch said firmly. "This town's been unkind to you, but you're not alone. You understand?" The simple words of support broke something inside Rose. Tears that she had been holding back all day suddenly spilled over, running down her cheeks in silent rivers. Mrs. Finch pulled her into a warm embrace, letting the young woman sob quietly against her shoulder. For a few moments, the only sounds in the room were Tommy's labored breathing and Rose's muffled cries. Then, cutting through the quiet like a knife, came the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. Rose pulled away from Mrs. Finch, hastily wiping her eyes. A sharp knock echoed through the room, and without waiting for an answer, Patrick Dolan pushed the door open. He strode in, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the clean floor. In his hands, he carried a sheaf of papers, his eyes glinting with barely concealed triumph. "Evening, ladies," Dolan said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Rose stood, placing herself between Dolan and Tommy's bed. "Mr. Dolan, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time," Dolan interrupted, waving the papers in front of him. "You see, Miss Lark, I've brought you an opportunity, a chance to make all your troubles disappear." Mrs. Finch stepped forward, her normally gentle face hard with anger. "Now see here, Mr. Dolan." But Dolan ignored her, his attention focused solely on Rose. "It's very simple, Miss Lark. You sign these papers, transferring the rights to your spring over to Dolan Water and Mining, and in return, I'll make sure all charges against Mr. Crow are dropped." His eyes flicked to Tommy's feverish form. "And of course you'll have the means to get proper medicine for your brother. Everybody wins." Rose felt as though the floor was tilting beneath her feet. She looked from Dolan's smug face to Tommy's sickbed, then thought of Elias sitting alone in a jail cell. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "That spring is all we have left of our mother. It's our home." Dolan's face hardened. Then I'm afraid you leave me no choice. Mr. Crow will face the full extent of the law, and as for your brother—" He shrugged, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, I hear the winter can be awfully hard on those with weak lungs." As if to emphasize Dolan's point, Tommy let out a harsh, racking cough that seemed to shake the entire bed. Rose turned to him, her heart breaking at the sight of his struggle. In that moment, Rose knew what she had to do. With tears streaming down her face, she turned back to Dolan. "Give me the papers," she said, her voice hollow. Mrs. Finch gasped, "Rose, no!" But Rose had made her choice. With a shaking hand, she took the pen Dolan offered and signed her name on the dotted line. With each stroke, she felt as though she was signing away a piece of her soul. Dolan snatched the papers back, his face split in a wide, triumphant grin. "Pleasure doing business with you, Miss Lark," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "I'll make sure Mr. Crow is released first thing in the morning." With that, he turned and left, his heavy footsteps echoing down the stairs. Rose stood frozen, the enormity of what she had done washing over her in waves. Mrs. Finch approached her cautiously, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Oh, my dear," she said softly. "I'm so sorry." As night fell, word spread quickly through the town. People gathered in small groups on the rain-slicked streets, watching as Dolan and his men moved with purpose through the darkness. They posted new notices on buildings and fences, their lanterns casting eerie shadows in the mist. From her window, Rose read the bold letters on one of the notices. "Blasting to begin at dawn." Her heart sank even further, realizing the full extent of what she had set in motion. Across town in his small jail cell, Elias Crow sat with his head bowed. He could hear the commotion outside, the rumble of crates being moved in the street. He knew without being told that those crates contained dynamite, ready to tear apart the land he had sworn to protect. Elias closed his eyes, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. In the quiet of his cell, he began to pray. He prayed for Rose and Tommy, for the land that was about to be scarred, and for the strength to face whatever morning would bring. As the town settled into an uneasy sleep, the rain finally began to taper off. In its place, a heavy silence fell, broken only by the occasional cough from Tommy's sickbed and the distant sound of preparations being made for the destruction to come. The sky was still dark, a deep indigo punctuated by fading stars, when a soft knock came at Rose's door. She hadn't slept, spending the night tending to Tommy's fever and wrestling with her own despair. With heavy steps, she crossed the room and opened the door to find Auntie Nijoni standing there, her weathered face etched with concern. "May I come in, child?" Auntie Nijoni asked softly. Rose nodded, stepping aside to let the older woman enter. Auntie Nijoni moved quietly to Tommy's bedside, placing a gnarled hand on his forehead. She clucked her tongue, then reached into her shawl and pulled out a small pouch of herbs. "Steep these in hot water," she instructed, handing the pouch to Rose. "It will help bring down his fever." As Rose moved to prepare the tea, Auntie Nijoni settled into a chair by the window. Her dark eyes, wise and knowing, studied Rose's slumped shoulders and tear-stained face. "You carry a heavy burden, Rose Lark," she said softly. "But remember this. Mercy is not surrender." Rose turned, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Auntie Nijoni smiled gently. "You showed mercy last night, signing away your spring to save your brother and free Elias. Some might see that as giving up. But it's not. It's surviving long enough to win." Rose's eyes filled with fresh tears. "But how can I win now? I've lost everything." "Not everything," came a new voice from the doorway. Mrs. Finch stood there, a determined look on her face and a worn ledger in her hands. "You still have this." Mrs. Finch stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She approached Rose and held out the ledger. "Years ago, when your mother first got that deed, I made a copy. I was afraid the preacher might lose it, you see. I've kept it safe in my store's safe all this time." With trembling hands, Rose took the ledger and opened it. There, carefully preserved between its pages, was an exact copy of the deed to the spring, complete with the territorial judge's seal and Chief Two Trail's signature. But, but I signed it away, Rose whispered, hope and confusion warring in her voice. Mrs. Finch's eyes glinted with determination. You signed Dolan's papers, yes, but this copy proves your original claim. It might just be enough to fight back. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, the sound of boots on the stairs made all three women tense. But it wasn't Dolan who appeared in the doorway. It was Elias Crow, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with a fierce light. Elias, Rose exclaimed, relief flooding through her. How did you— Dolan had me released on recognizance, Elias explained, his voice gruff. Wanted to appear fair, I reckon. But I knew something wasn't right. He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the gathered women before settling on Rose. Despite the paleness of her face and the dark circles under her eyes, there was a new determination in her stance. Rose, he said softly, what happened? In halting words, Rose explained about Dolan's ultimatum, her decision to sign away the spring, and the discovery of Mrs. Finch's copy of the deed. As she spoke, Elias's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. That low-down scheming, he began, but Auntie Najoni cut him off with a sharp look. Now is not the time for anger, she said firmly. Now is the time for action. Rose nodded, clutching the ledger to her chest. I have a plan, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. We can fight back. We can prove that Dolan's claim is false. Elias studied her face, seeing the fire that had rekindled in her eyes. He nodded slowly. All right, Rose. What do you need me to do? As Rose began to outline her plan, the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, painting the room in shades of gold. Outside, they could hear the sounds of Dolan's men preparing for the blasting, but inside this small room a spark of hope had ignited. Mrs. Finch placed a supportive hand on Rose's shoulder. Whatever you need, dear, I'm with you. Auntie Najoni nodded in agreement. As am I. The spirits of your ancestors stand with you, Roselark. Elias stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring. We'll face this together, he said softly. Rose looked around at the faces of her allies. Mrs. Finch's kindness, Auntie Najoni's wisdom, Elias's strength. She felt a surge of gratitude and determination. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. All of you. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the town, Rose Lark stood tall, the precious ledger in her hands and her friends by her side. The battle for the spring was far from over, but now, against all odds, she had regained a fighting chance. The mid-morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of the small Colorado town as Reverend Josiah Bell made his way towards Mrs. Finch's mercantile. His usual confident stride was replaced by hesitant steps, and his hands fidgeted nervously with the worn leather satchel he carried. As he approached the door, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. Inside the mercantile's back room, Rose, Elias, Mrs. Finch, and Auntie Najoni were gathered around a small table, poring over the copied deed and discussing their next move. The sound of the bell above the door made them all look up, tension visible in their faces. Reverend Bell entered, his eyes downcast and his shoulders slumped. Miss Lark, he said softly, I need to speak with you. All of you, if I may. Rose nodded, gesturing to an empty chair. Of course, Reverend. Please, sit down. The preacher lowered himself into the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed his satchel on the table and looked up, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I've come to confess something, he began. Something I should have done years ago. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the Reverend as he reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table. This is my notary journal, he explained. I witnessed Rose's mother's deed years ago, but when Dolan and his backers came to town, I hid it. I was afraid of what they might do if they knew I had proof of the original claim. Rose's eyes widened, a mix of shock and hope flickering across her face. You mean, you have proof that the deed is legitimate? Reverend Bell nodded, opening the journal to a marked page. It's all here. The matching entries, my seal. Everything to prove that your mother's claim is valid and predates Dolan's by years. Mrs. Finch leaned forward, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she examined the journal. Well, I'll be, she murmured. This could change everything. Auntie Nozomi placed a comforting hand on Rose's shoulder, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. The spirits work in mysterious ways, child. They have brought the truth to light. Elias, who had been standing by the window, his arms crossed and his face unreadable, finally spoke. Why now, Reverend? His voice was low, but there was no anger in it, only a quiet curiosity. Reverend Bell looked up at him, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Because I was a coward, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I let fear guide my actions instead of faith. But I can't do that anymore. I won't be a coward again. The room fell silent once more as the weight of the Reverend's words settled over them. Rose reached out, her hand gently covering the preacher's trembling one. Thank you, she said softly. This means more than you know. Elias uncrossed his arms, his stern expression softening slightly. He didn't speak, but his eyes met the Reverend's, and a look of understanding passed between them. As the group began to discuss their next steps, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Where there had been desperation and uncertainty, now there was a cautious hope. The Reverend's journal, combined with Mrs. Finch's copy of the deed, provided a solid legal foundation for Rose's claim. However, their planning was interrupted by the sound of heavy wagons rumbling down the street. Elias moved to the window, his body tensing as he watched the procession. Dolan's crew, he said grimly. They're hauling powder towards the spring. Rose stood, her face paling. They're going to blast, but they can't. We have proof now. Mrs. Finch shook her head. Dolan won't care about proof until he's forced to. He's counting on destroying the spring before we can stop him. Elias turned from the window, his jaw set in determination. We need to buy some time, he said. Enough to get this evidence to the proper authorities. But how? Rose asked, her voice tinged with desperation. They'll be at the spring within the hour. Elias's eyes flickered to a bucket sitting in the corner of the room. Without a word, he strode over and picked it up, then headed for the door. Elias, Rose called after him, what are you doing? He paused at the threshold, looking back at the group. His eyes met Rose's, and for a moment, the hardness in them softened. What needs to be done? He said simply. Don't worry. I'll buy you the time you need. Before anyone could protest, Elias was out the door. They watched through the window as he mounted his horse, the bucket secured to his saddle, and rode off in the direction of the spring. Rose pressed a hand to the glass, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and admiration. Be careful, she whispered. Reverend Bell stood, his posture straighter than it had been when he entered. We should get this evidence to the judge immediately, he said. Every moment counts now. As the group gathered their documents and prepared to make their case, the sound of Elias's horse's hoofbeats faded into the distance. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting short shadows as the town held its breath, waiting to see what the next hours would bring. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the Colorado sky in hues of orange and purple as Elias Crow approached the spring. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of men's voices carried on the evening breeze. As he drew closer, he could see Dolan's blasting crew bustling around crates of dynamite, preparing for their destructive work. Elias dismounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He untied the bucket he had brought from town, now full of cool spring water. The men noticed him then, their chatter dying down as they watched him warily. Evening, fellas, Elias said, his voice calm and steady. Mighty fine night for a swim, don't you think? The men exchanged confused glances, hands hovering near their weapons. One of them, a burly man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. You best turn around and head back where you came from, old man. This here's company business. Elias nodded, as if considering the man's words. "I reckon it is," he said. "But I've got some business of my own to attend to." Without warning, Elias upended the bucket, dousing the nearest crate of dynamite with spring water. The men shouted in alarm, scrambling to protect the explosives, but Elias was already moving to the next crate. "What in tarnation do you think you're doing?" the burly man yelled, his face red with anger. Elias continued his work, his movements methodical and unhurried. "Just sharing some of this fine spring water," he replied. "Seems a shame to blast it all away when it's got so much life to give." The crew watched in stunned silence as Elias systematically soaked every fuse and stick of dynamite. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably, looking to their leader for guidance. But the burly man seemed at a loss, clearly unprepared for this peaceful act of defiance. As the last of the water dripped from Elias's bucket, he set about stacking the now harmless crates of explosives. His weathered hands moved with purpose, arranging them neatly as if he were stocking shelves in a general store. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Elias finished his work. He stood back, surveying the orderly stack of crates with satisfaction. From his pocket, he produced a small piece of paper and a stub of pencil. The men watched in curious silence as he scribbled a brief message. Elias placed the note atop the crates, weighing it down with a small stone. In the fading light, the words were clear for all to see. "This water is for life. Lay down your powder." The burly man stepped forward, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. "You can't just— We have orders," he stammered. Elias turned to face him, his eyes kind but resolute. "I reckon you do," he said softly. "But sometimes a man's got to choose between following orders and doing what's right. This spring, it's life for folks around here, for their children, for their future." A murmur rippled through the crew. Some of the men nodded, while others looked away, unable to meet Elias's gaze. "Now," Elias continued, "I ain't here to fight, just to remind you all what's really at stake. You boys think on that, and decide if blasting this spring is something you can live with." With that, Elias turned and walked back to his horse. He could feel the men's eyes on him as he mounted up, but not a single one made a move to stop him. As he rode away, he heard the sound of boots scuffling and low voices conferring. The stars were just beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky as Elias made his way back to town. The gentle rhythm of his horse's hooves and the cool night air brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He had faced down Dolan's crew without violence, using only water and words to make his point. It felt right, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As the lights of the town came into view, Elias's thoughts turned to Rose and Tommy. He wondered if they were waiting for him, if they were safe. The thought of them brought a warmth to his chest that had nothing to do with the evening's exertion. Sure enough, as he rode down the main street, he saw 2 lamps burning bright in the window above Mrs. Finch's mercantile. Even from a distance, he could make out 2 silhouettes, one tall and graceful, the other small and slight. Rose and Tommy keeping vigil for his return. Elias dismounted in front of the mercantile, his bones creaking a bit as his feet hit the ground. He was tired, the events of the day catching up with him, but there was a contentment in his weariness. He had done what needed to be done, and he had done it without shedding blood or causing harm. As he tied up his horse, the door to the mercantile opened. Rose stepped out, Tommy close behind her. The lamplight from inside cast a warm glow around them, and Elias felt something stir in his heart at the sight. "You're back," Rose said softly, relief evident in her voice. "We were so worried." Elias nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No need to fret," he said. "Everything's taken care of, at least for now." Tommy peered up at him, eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you stop the bad men, Mr. Crow?" he asked. Elias ruffled the boy's hair gently. "I reckon I did, son. But not in the way you might think. Sometimes, the best way to stop bad things from happening is to remind folks of the good in themselves." Rose stepped closer, her eyes searching Elias's face. "What happened out there?" she asked. Elias took a deep breath, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. "I showed them the power of the spring," he said simply. used its water to render their powder useless, left them with a choice to make. Rose's eyes widened in understanding. You didn't fight them? Elias shook his head. No, ma'am, no fighting. Just a reminder of what's truly important. A smile spread across Rose's face, bright as the rising sun. You chose mercy, she said softly. Elias nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him at her words. Reckon I did, he said. Seemed the right thing to do. As they stood there in the quiet night, the stars twinkling above them, Elias felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years. He had faced down a threat not with violence, but with compassion and wisdom. And now, looking at Rose and Tommy, he knew he had found something worth protecting, worth fighting for. A family. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tension that hung over the small Colorado town. The church, usually a place of quiet worship, buzzed with activity as townsfolk filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Today, the humble building would serve as an impromptu courtroom, the fate of Rose Lark's spring hanging in the balance. Rose stood near the front, her back straight and her eyes steady despite the worry that churned in her stomach. Beside her, Elias Crow offered a reassuring nod, his weathered face set with determination. Tommy fidgeted nearby, his small hand clasped tightly in Mrs. Finch's comforting grip. On the other side of the aisle, Patrick Dolan strode in, flanked by a pair of slick-looking company lawyers. Their polished boots clicked against the wooden floor, a sharp contrast to the worn soles of the townsfolk. Dolan's eyes narrowed as they fell on Rose, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Reverend Josiah Bell, looking more resolute than he had in years, called the gathering to order. His voice, usually reserved for sermons, rang out clear and strong. We're here today to settle the matter of water rights for the Lark Spring, he announced. Both parties will present their case and will seek a just resolution. Dolan's lawyer stepped forward first, his voice oily and confident. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dolan Water and Mining Company has a legitimate claim to this water source. The needs of progress and industry must be considered for the good of all. As he spoke, Rose felt a gentle pressure on her arm. She turned to see Chief Two Trails standing beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as an ancient oak. His eyes, wise with years, met hers, and she drew strength from his silent support. When it was their turn to speak, Rose stepped forward, her voice clear despite her nerves. I stand before you not just for myself, but for the memory of my mother and the future of my brother, she began. This spring has been in our family for generations, recognized by both territorial and tribal law. She produced the agency affirmation, its official seal glinting in the sunlight that streamed through the church windows. This document, reaffirmed just days ago, proves our right to the water. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Rose continued, presenting Mrs. Finch's carefully preserved copy of the original deed. The storekeeper stood a little straighter, pride shining in her eyes, as Rose explained its significance. Reverend Bell, his hands trembling slightly, stepped forward with his notary journal. I must confess that I witnessed the original deed years ago, he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I hid this journal out of fear, but I can no longer stay silent. The entries here match the deed exactly. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and Dolan's face darkened with anger. His lawyers huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Just as it seemed the tide was turning in Rose's favor, the church door swung open with a creak. A hush fell over the gathering as a man in a crisp uniform stepped inside, his badge glinting in the light. The federal marshal's presence commanded immediate attention. Pardon the interruption, the marshal said, his voice carrying easily through the now silent church. But I believe these documents are relevant to your proceedings. He held up a thick sheaf of papers, their edges yellowed with age. Dolan's lawyers exchanged worried glances as the marshal approached the front of the church. These are treaty papers, he explained, showing clearly that the railroad's claim to this water source violates prior promises made to both settlers and native peoples in this region. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Rose felt her heart leap with hope, while Dolan's face grew increasingly pale. The marshal turned to face Dolan directly. "Mr. Patrick Dolan," he said, his voice stern, "based on the evidence presented here today and the information contained in these treaty papers, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud and coercion." The church erupted in shocked exclamations. Dolan's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted, backing away. "Do you know who I work for? The power they have?" But the marshal was unmoved. "The law applies to everyone, Mr. Dolan, no matter who they work for." He produced a pair of handcuffs, the metal clinking ominously in the suddenly quiet church. As the marshal read Dolan his rights, the company lawyers gathered their papers in a flurry of activity. Without a word, they hurried out of the church, leaving their client to face the consequences alone. Rose stood in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe what was happening. She felt Elias's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "It's over," he said softly. "You did it, Rose. You stood your ground, and justice prevailed." Tears welled in Rose's eyes as the reality of their victory sank in. Tommy rushed to her side, throwing his arms around her waist. "Does this mean we get to keep our spring?" he asked, his young face alight with hope. Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked around at the faces of those who had stood by her, Mrs. Finch beaming with pride, Reverend Bell, a weight lifted from his shoulders, Chief Two Trails nodding in solemn approval. As the marshal led a protesting Dolan out of the church, the townsfolk began to celebrate. Cheers and applause filled the air, a joyous sound that seemed to make the very rafters shake. In that moment, standing in the warm sunlight streaming through the church windows, Rose felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had faced seemingly insurmountable odds, but with the support of her community and the strength of truth on her side, justice had prevailed. The spring, lifeblood of her family and a symbol of hope for the future, was safe at last. The church, still buzzing with excitement from Dolan's arrest, settled into a hushed anticipation as the judge called for order. The makeshift courtroom, with its wooden pews and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, held its collective breath as Chief Two Trails stepped forward. The elderly Comanche leader's presence commanded respect, his weathered face etched with wisdom earned through decades of struggle and negotiation. He stood tall, his eyes sweeping across the gathered townsfolk, tribal members, and officials before settling on the judge. "Your Honor," Chief Two Trails began, his voice strong and clear, "we stand at a crossroads. The water that flows from the Lark Spring has been a source of life for generations, and now it must become a source of unity." Rose listened intently, her heart swelling with hope as the chief continued. "I propose a water covenant," he said, "a sacred agreement to be managed jointly by the town, our tribe, and the church. This covenant will ensure that the water is used wisely and fairly, with the Lark family stewardship honored as it has been for many years." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of surprise and consideration. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Please elaborate, Chief Two Trails," he requested. The chief nodded, his hands moving gracefully as he spoke. "The covenant will establish a council with representatives from each group. They will oversee water usage, resolve disputes, and ensure that the spring remains a blessing for all. The Lark family, as the rightful stewards, will have a central role in this council." Rose felt Elias's reassuring hand on her shoulder as she stood, Tommy clutching her skirt. The weight of responsibility settled on her, but it felt right, like a mantle passed down through generations. The judge considered the proposal, his brow furrowed in thought. After a moment, he looked up, his eyes bright with approval. "This is a wise and just solution," he declared. "It honors the legal rights of the Lark family while ensuring the water serves the entire community. I hereby approve the formation of this water covenant." The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling to fill every corner of the church. Rose felt tears of joy and relief spill down her cheeks as Tommy whooped with excitement. Elias, usually so stoic, broke into a wide grin. As the celebration began to quiet, Reverend Josiah Bell stepped forward, his shoulders hunched with the weight of his conscience. He approached Rose and Tommy, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Rose, Tommy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I must ask for your forgiveness. I hid the truth out of fear, and in doing so, I nearly cost you everything. I am deeply sorry for my cowardice. Rose looked at the preacher, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. She thought of the long nights of worry, the strain on Tommy's health, and the battles they had faced. Yet, as she stood there in the warm light of victory, she felt a wave of compassion wash over her. Reverend Bell, she said softly, taking his trembling hands in hers, I forgive you. We all face moments of fear, but what matters is that you found the courage to stand up for what's right in the end. Tommy, always quick to follow his sister's lead, nodded vigorously. Yeah, we forgive you, Reverend, he chirped, his young face serious. The preacher's relief was palpable, his shoulders straightening as if a great burden had been lifted. Rose squeezed his hands gently before releasing them. Now, she said, her voice growing stronger, I urge you to use your position to help keep this water flowing for all. Your voice can be a powerful force for good in this covenant. Reverend Bell nodded, determination replacing the shame in his eyes. I swear to you, Rose, I will do everything in my power to uphold this covenant and ensure the water serves everyone fairly. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, a remarkable scene unfolded at the Lark Spring. Townsfolk and tribal riders worked side by side, their labor punctuated by laughter and shared stories. The old restrictive fence was torn down, replaced by a new gate that stood as a symbol of unity and shared purpose. Elias, his shirt sleeves rolled up and sweat glistening on his brow, worked alongside Chief Two Trails to hang a freshly painted sign. As they stepped back, the words gleamed in the fading sunlight. Lark Spring, water for life. Rose stood nearby, Tommy perched on her hip as they watched the community come together. Mrs. Finch approached, carrying a basket of fresh bread and jars of preserves. For the workers, she said with a wink, setting it down on a nearby stump. As the evening wore on, more and more townspeople arrived, bringing food and drink to share. An impromptu celebration bloomed around the spring, with music from guitars and native flutes mingling in the cool night air. Rose found herself at the center of it all, receiving handshakes and words of gratitude from people who had once looked at her with suspicion. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Chief Two Trails, his eyes twinkling. You have done your mother proud, little dove, he said, using her Comanche name. This spring will flow with life for many generations to come, thanks to your courage. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Rose looked around at the faces of her neighbors, now truly her community. The water covenant had done more than secure the spring. It had bridged divides and brought healing to wounds both old and new. In that moment, with Tommy's warm weight in her arms and the sound of laughter and music in the air, Rose felt a deep sense of peace. The spring bubbled nearby, a constant reminder of the life-giving power of water and the strength found in unity. In the days that followed the establishment of the water covenant, a gentle rhythm settled over the town. The contentious atmosphere that had gripped the community for so long began to soften, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and shared purpose. Nowhere was this change more evident than in the bustling activity around Mrs. Finch's mercantile. Elias Crow, more accustomed to the solitude of the high country than the bustle of town life, found himself drawn increasingly to the upper room above the store. With calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work, he set about building a porch rail that would transform the simple living space into something more. The sound of his hammer rang out in the crisp morning air as he carefully measured and cut each piece of wood. Passers-by would look up, shading their eyes against the sun, to see the grizzled mountain man working with surprising gentleness. Some even called out greetings, which Elias answered with a nod or a lifted hand, his usual reticence slowly giving way to a cautious warmth. Rose Lark watched Elias work from the doorway, a small smile playing on her lips. She held a wooden box filled with rich, dark soil, the scent of earth mingling with the fresh-cut pine of Elias's project. As he finished securing the last section of rail, Rose stepped out onto the newly built porch. It's perfect, she said softly, running her hand along the smooth wood. Elias ducked his head, unused to praise, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with pleasure. Rose knelt down, setting the box carefully against the rail. From her apron pocket, she produced a small packet of seeds. "Sweet peas," she explained, catching Elias's curious glance. "My mother always said they bring luck and kindness." As Rose worked the seeds into the soil, Tommy appeared in the doorway, his arms full of colorful paper shapes. "I made more trout," he announced proudly, his voice clear and strong, free from the rasping cough that had plagued him for so long. Elias crouched down beside the boy, examining the intricate folds and cuts that formed the delicate fish. "Fine work, Tommy," he said. His gruff voice softened with genuine admiration. "Where shall we hang them?" Together, the unlikely trio spent the next hour stringing the paper trout along the new porch rail. Tommy chattered excitedly about each fish, explaining the different species he had tried to recreate. Rose listened with a mother's patience, while Elias found himself drawn into the boy's enthusiasm, offering tidbits about the real fish he had encountered in mountain streams. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the town, the aroma of freshly baked pie wafted up from below. Mrs. Finch appeared, carefully balancing a still-steaming apple pie in her hands. "Land sakes!" she exclaimed, taking in the transformed porch. "This place finally looks lived in." Her eyes twinkled as she set the pie down on a small table Elias had crafted earlier in the week. "I thought you might need something to celebrate your new home." Rose's eyes widened at the word home, and she glanced quickly at Elias. The mountain man stood still for a moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Reckon it is at that," he said quietly. As they shared the pie, the sounds of the town drifted up from below. Children's laughter mingled with the clop of horse hooves and the distant rush of the spring. Rose leaned on the rail, looking out over the main street. She could see people moving to and from the spring, townsfolk and members of the tribe alike, drawing water side by side, exchanging greetings and news. "It's working," she murmured half to herself. "The covenant, it's really bringing people together." Elias stepped up beside her, following her gaze. "Seems so," he agreed. His hand rested on the rail near hers, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. "Funny thing is, I'm finding myself wanting to stay in town more often than heading back to the high country." Rose turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. Elias met her gaze steadily. "Reckon there's more here worth staying for than I realized," he said softly. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the little family on the porch above the mercantile sat in comfortable silence. Tommy had fallen asleep, his head pillowed on Rose's lap. Elias sat nearby, whittling a small wooden horse for the boy. The sweet peas in their box had yet to sprout, but the promise of their bloom hung in the air like hope. The paper trout swayed gently in the evening breeze, a whimsical touch to their new home. And below, the spring continued to flow, a constant reminder of the life-giving power of water, and the strength found in community. The evening air had grown cool as autumn's first whispers crept into the Colorado foothills. Golden lamplight spilled from the window above Mrs. Finch's mercantile, casting a warm glow onto the darkening street below. The day's bustle had faded, leaving behind a gentle quiet broken only by the distant rush of lark spring and the occasional whinny of a horse being settled for the night. Elias Crow stood at the threshold of the upper room, his weathered hat clutched in calloused hands. He paused, taking a deep breath that carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. His eyes, usually sharp and watchful, now held a softness rarely seen. He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could meet the wood, the door swung open. Rose Lark stood there, her face illuminated by the warm light from within. A gentle smile played across her lips, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of joy and something deeper, a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come inside. I've been waiting for you." The words echoed those she had spoken months ago in the church doorway, but this time there was no misunderstanding, no curious stares from passers-by. There was only welcome, pure and simple. Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the last lingering chill of his solitary years. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold with a sense of coming home he hadn't felt since he was a boy. The room enveloped him in its embrace. The air was rich with the aroma of beef stew simmering on the stove, mingled with the sweet scent of fresh-baked bread. Tommy sat at the table, carefully setting out mismatched plates and cups, his face alight with concentration and excitement. "Mr. Crow," Tommy exclaimed, nearly dropping a spoon in his enthusiasm. "You're just in time. Rose made your favorite, beef and barley stew." Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't recall the last time someone had bothered to remember his favorite meal, let alone prepare it specially. "Much obliged," he managed, his voice gruff with feeling. Rose moved to the stove, ladling generous portions into bowls. "I hope you're hungry," she said, her eyes meeting Elias's with a warmth that made his heart skip. "Tommy insisted we wait for you before we started." As they settled around the table, a peal from the church bell drifted through the open window. Its soft tones seemed to bless the little gathering, a gentle reminder of the community that had come together to protect the spring and, in doing so, had brought this unlikely family together. Elias bowed his head as Rose offered a simple grace, thanking the Lord for food, for family, and for second chances. As they began to eat, the room filled with the sounds of clinking spoons and easy conversation. Tommy regaled them with tales of his day at school, while Rose shared news from Mrs. Finch's store below. Elias found himself relaxing, drawn into the warmth of their company. He even shared a story of his own, describing a family of beavers he'd watched building a dam high in the mountains. Tommy's eyes grew wide with wonder, and Rose listened intently, her hand resting close to Elias's on the table. As the meal drew to a close, the sound of running water from the spring seemed to grow louder, carried on the night air. It was a constant reminder of the life-giving force that had brought them all together, of the struggles they had faced and overcome. Elias stood, moving to the window. He gazed out at the darkened town, seeing not the buildings and streets, but the people within them, Mrs. Finch, Reverend Bell, Chief Two Trails, and all the others who had played a part in their story. He felt a profound sense of belonging, of having found his place in a world he had long kept at arm's length. Turning back to Rose and Tommy, Elias saw his future reflected in their eyes. Here was redemption, not just for him, but for all of them. Here was family, chosen and cherished. Here was home. As the church bell tolled once more, its sound mingling with the eternal flow of the spring, Elias Crow knew with certainty that he had finally found where he belonged. In this room, with these people, he was no longer a solitary figure on the fringes of life. He was part of something greater, a family, a community, a shared story of hope and renewal. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.